All right, here we go. Kinesiology 223. This is chapter, 23. We're still talking children in sport. This is presentation number 3. We're talking about stress and burnout in children's sports. And usually the stress and burnout that children experience have less to do with them and more to do with everything around them. Because most youth athletes just don't have excessive levels of state anxiety. Some kids will be more anxious than others, don't get me wrong. But, most kids just enjoy the fun of playing and enjoy the fun of sport. But there are some children who they get into a sport environment, perhaps they're placed there by their parents, and it's not the right fit. They shouldn't be playing football. They'd be better suited for playing a different sport. Maybe they should be playing a non-contact sport like soccer, or they could play a sport that has a little different level of contact, say like lacrosse or something that is different. But many times parents just jam their kids into a sport thinking they're doing them a favor when in fact they're causing them to have an increased level of anxiety because they just can't perform. And with study after study, and we'll go over here, competitive state anxiety inventory for children, excuse me, um, they ask these athletes, um, they only have slightly elevated trait anxiety levels when it's all said and done. But in a different study, the results show that children participating in team sports had reduced anxiety symptoms over the course of a year. So what's interesting about this is from 1979, the other one's 1991. So these are a little bit dated, but I still want to go back to them because they're in the book. Um, they talk about the anxiety levels of boys 9 to 14, and state anxiety levels were compared among participants in a band, both soloist within the band and the band ensemble, which is interesting because it's like being an individual versus a team, and students taking academic tests, students in competitive physical education classes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And what they found is that young athletes have at most or slightly elevated trait anxiety levels. Moreover, half the studies, no differences were found. So, children just kind of don't feel that stress like adults do because they don't really understand the skin in the game sometimes when it comes to sports, and they're still there for the fun of it. Um, Now, can it buffer the effects of social anxiety or fear, right? Can sports do that? And the results revealed that children participating in team sports had reduced social anxiety symptoms over the course of a year. So, yes, in that example, being involved in sports, having sports participation could buffer the effects of social anxiety. So, interestingly, the athletes who participated in sports really didn't have state anxiety or didn't have um, an increased state anxiety level. And then what was interesting down here is in the terms of social anxiety, sports actually help that. So you can put your young kids into a sport and they really shouldn't get too, unless they're egregiously in the wrong place, they shouldn't get too stressed out by being in that sport. Now, that again, that's to say you're putting your child in the right place. And on scale, whether it's the wrestlers or we're talking about performance in the band or we're talking about being down here and participating in the sport, there's no deleterious effects up here, and there's actually a benefit shown down here. Now, with heightened state anxiety, they look at these personal and situational factors, right, that are associated with heightened state anxiety. And this becomes now a conversation of it's less about the actual performance, if you will. It's less about the um, the actual sport itself, and it's more about, in some regards, the baggage that that child is unfortunately forced to carry with them when they go to a sport. I hate to say it like that, but that's just what it is. And they look at personal and situational factors that are associated, and they were what they did is they administered background and personality measures away from the competitive setting at practice and then before and after competition, and they evaluated how those athletes felt. And when you read through this, um, you look at ratings to pressure participate, assessments in practice, immediate before and after competition, etc. And as we get into this further, they found that you have they came up with like a profile to be able to look at the background and what the student athlete or the athlete is bringing into a competitive environment, and they can start to pick out those athletes who might be at risk for having unhealthy levels of competitive state anxiety. And they started to look into this, and what they found is, there's a gray box down here in terms of heightened state anxiety. Hold on, that I'll get to in 1 second. But they talk about this study as well in terms of some studies have looked at elite junior athletes of high school age, and elite high school distance runners had stress in performing up to their ability, improving on their last performance, participating in champion meets, not performing well, and not being mentally ready. And I read that and I'm like, wow, that's like a word salad, right? And I had to really parse that out. Some studies have looked at elite junior athletes of high school age. For instance, elite high school distance runners had stress in performing up to their ability, improving on their last performance, participating in championship meets, and not performing well and not being mentally ready. So there's a couple different contributing factors there that would increase competitive state anxiety. So it might, at first read, you're kind of like, what in the world are they saying here? But what they're really doing is listing out these different things that these elite high school distance runners, the things that cause increased competitive state anxiety, if I can say it correctly. And with the wrestlers, they cited similar. Now, this is again 1983. Perhaps at some point we can come up with some better research or newer research, but we'll take this for now. So when you look at more elite junior competitors, they seem stressed primarily by fear of failure and feelings of inadequacy. And to a certain degree, now they have a body of work because they're elite at this level, and they're competing at a very high level. So that means they have a body of work in terms of competing against other people, and now they have a better idea of how good or bad they actually are. And so as a result, they place more stress upon themselves, and they end up having heightened competitive state anxiety because they've put some pressure on themselves to not lose. And it becomes this kind of maladaptive perfectionism that you see. Now, this is a list. I'll let you kind of read through this. Pause me if you want, but just kind of take a peek, and I'm going to skip on to the next slide here in 1, go. So particular situations that can be a source of stress. They list 3 of these to the right. In defeat, event importance, and sport type, and you can kind of just read through those and understand what those are. When you lose a game, or when you're losing a game and about to lose a game, even worse, they have higher state anxiety and event importance. And perhaps if you're going from regular season to sectionals, regionals, state, etc., or nationals for your track team, you're going to have greater event importance. And then within the sport type, when you have the individual who's maybe just wrestling one-on-one, that's a little bit different than team. A tennis player playing one-on-one is different than playing doubles, so you kind of think of it in terms of when the spotlight is on one person, one athlete, that's going to create a higher stress environment for that athlete. So now, consequently, we got to understand this. We have to understand which athletes might operate with a heightened competitive state anxiety, and knowing what situations might trigger them is also of benefit. So burnout. We talked a ton about burnout previously, and I'm just going to kind of rip through this. But, an athlete loses interest as a result of specialization in a particular sport at a very early age. So often, youth athletes are being pulled to batting practice, pulled to fielding practice. They go to their speed coach, they go to their game, then they go to a travel clinic, for example, or they might even go to a tournament in Iowa, right? So here you have an athlete that's being drugged around all over the place. In some regards, maybe the parents are throwing in a little bit of martyrdom. And, eventually the child's like, well, this is too much weight to carry. This is just too much. I'm done. It's no longer fun anymore. So in some regard, you could even have the example of taking an athlete who's trying to play, or whose parents are trying to have the athlete play at a very high level, and maybe put them back into house league as opposed to travel, and just let them enjoy the game once again, and let them kind of reinvigorate and rekindle their love for the game. Because in essence, what happens in that situation, the child is only going to go along for the ride. How much autonomy does a child have? But what's interesting is that child will be lacking in autonomy and the volition to make their own choices until there comes a time that they're passive aggressive about it and decide to not be actively engaged. And it's kind of like they're there, but they're not. In essence, it's absenteeism in the sport, or they just patently say, I'm not going, I'm done, and they quit the sport completely. That has more to do with the parents, to some degree the coach, than it does the athlete, especially at a young age, 100%. And usually it's a matter of this, and we understand that burnout is a special case of sport withdrawal when a young athlete discontinues. But I'm going to say it again, it's less to do with the athlete, more to do with the environmental stuff with the parents and perhaps a coach. They have this kind of one-dimensional sense of self. They wrap themselves completely around the fact they're a great third baseman, and they can only see themselves in that role. So maybe as a coach, you need to start moving your athletes around a little bit once in a while. But the other part of it is you need to have your athletes in multiple sports. If you're going to have a kid and you're going to focus on baseball, you're doing them a disservice. Most of your great athletes didn't play just one sport. They played multiple sports and they developed their skill set over the course of several years developmentally. During developmental years. And it ends up broadening their horizon. It gives them more things to shoot for. And there's lessons to be learned in one sport that could possibly be carried over into another sport. And what you have is, by the specialization, it's a case where, as I mentioned before, they really don't have any locus of control. They really don't have control of their own situation. If they're going to batting practice, fielding practice, and they're going to a speed coach, that's on the parents, man. The parents are the ones jamming them into that. And the kid doesn't have any control of their own destiny, and he can't really say no because the parents have them scheduled 6 months out to do batting practice. It's silly. It really is. And so what happens is the younger athlete then feels this heightened amount of stress and state anxiety because the parents have invested so much time and effort and energy into them becoming better athletes that they have to become better athletes, and they don't want to let the parents down. I will tell you that in some regard, I said it in an earlier presentation, in some regard, parents try to do their best and what they believe is their best for their young athlete. But in some regard, they're setting their young athletes up for failure because they're setting them up with an unrealistic expectation. And if you throw in like the martyrdom, like I mentioned before, and I'm doing this all for you, and I got to go, I'm on the phone, I got to go to work, and I got to come home, then it becomes a whole nother conversation about what the parent wants the child to see as opposed to what the child should be learning about sport and activity. But that's a whole nother parenting conversation. But that plays in. If you're ever coaching youth athletes, that absolutely plays in. So I will tell you that sometimes your young athletes will carry in duffel bags full of stress that has nothing to do with the sport, and it's nothing you did, but it's because they're carrying the weight of the parents into the sport environment. So when you look at this, unlike the usual state anxiety felt before contest, a child en route to burnout, it doesn't really go away. That child constantly feels that baggage, like they're carrying around a heavy bag full of equipment, and it just gets heavier and heavier. And so it never ever goes away. And then the burnt out state is the end. And what I'm telling you is, as a parent or a coach, if you recognize that, you may have to pull your child out of travel and put them into house league for baseball or softball. Put them in a place where they can once again enjoy the game and not feel the heavy weight of obligation. All right, special determinants of burnout. Either side, it could be laissez-faire or autocratic coach. They have high levels of stress outside the sport because of family, etc. They don't get a lot of sleep, and there's less inclination to make psychological sacrifices. And I'll say this again, if you want, you can pause and read through this. I'm not going to go ahead and read through this. I'm running out of time. But it's a matter of how do you lower the trait anxiety, increase self-esteem, and help your athletes become better without stressing them out. In practice, you want a positive coaching environment, constructive attitude towards mistakes, reduce social evaluation, make it where they have small benchmarks and small wins across the way. It's not the win at the end at the game, but it's how they've learned as they've progressed in their sport. 15 minutes on the dot. Checking out.